October 1961. West Texas. A small farm outside Lubbock, where the wind never seems to stop moving and the dust finds its way into every crack a man forgets to seal. On a cold Saturday morning, a widow stands beside an old tractor and waits for strangers to decide what it is worth. The tractor is parked near the edge of the yard, its faded red paint worn thin by years of sun and harvest dust. One rear tire is patched. The seat has been repaired twice. The engine leaks a little oil when it runs. To most people gathered there, it looks like a machine that has seen better days. By noon, it will belong to somebody else. Mary Collins stands with her hands folded in front of her black coat. She has been standing there since sunrise. She watches pickup trucks roll down the dirt road and pull into the field beside her house. Men climb out. Neighbors. Farmers. Curious onlookers. Some remove their hats when they see her. Most do not know what to say. 32 years her family has worked this land. Today she is selling the last thing her husband ever owned. The farm itself is already gone. The cattle went first. The equipment followed. The grain bins were sold in August. The pickup truck disappeared 2 weeks ago. Only the tractor remained. Everyone in the county knows why. The tractor was never just equipment. It was Frank Collins. For nearly 3 decades, nobody could remember seeing one without the other. If the wheat needed planting, Frank was on the tractor. If a storm knocked down fences, Frank was on the tractor. If a neighbor got stuck in mud 3 miles away, Frank would climb onto that same metal seat before daylight and drive out to help. People joked that the machine knew the way home better than most men. Now Frank has been gone for 8 months. And Mary cannot afford to keep what remains. The notices came during the summer. The bills came after that. One by one, every choice became smaller than the one before it. Until eventually there were no choices left at all. Only the auction. A folding table has been set near the barn. The auctioneer is arranging papers. Several men stand around the tractor looking it over. One kicks a tire. Another studies the engine. Nobody speaks very loudly. There is something uncomfortable about putting a price on a dead man's life. Still, that is exactly what is about to happen. The bidding sheet already has a number written beside the tractor. $50. Nobody expects it to bring much more. Mary knows it. The neighbors know it. Even the auctioneer knows it. An old tractor is an old tractor. That is what everyone keeps telling themselves. But standing there in the cold morning air, looking at the machine her husband spent half his life sitting on, Mary cannot stop thinking about one thing. By sunset, the tractor will be gone. And with it, the last piece of Frank Collins she can still touch. What happened next was something nobody standing in that yard ever forgot. Frank Collins bought the tractor in the spring of 1933. The country was still crawling its way out of hard times then. Money was scarce. Rain was uncertain. Most men held on to every dollar they could find. Frank spent nearly all of his. The tractor wasn't new. Even then, it had already worked another farm before reaching his hands. But to Frank Collins it looked like the future. Before that machine arrived, everything depended on horses and long days that seemed to stretch forever. A field that took days to work suddenly took hours. Ground that once felt too large for one family suddenly felt manageable. Frank drove it home himself. The story was told so many times that half the county knew it by heart. He drove 30 miles behind the wheel that day, grinning the whole way, stopping only twice to let the engine cool. When he reached the farm, Mary was waiting on the porch. Frank jumped down from the seat and told her they were going to build something that would last. At the time, neither of them had much reason to believe it. The farmhouse was small. The roof leaked. The fields were stubborn. But year after year they kept working. And the tractor worked right alongside them. It plowed wheat. It hauled hay. It pulled wagons loaded with feed. It dragged fence posts, water tanks, and once, according to Frank, an entire shed that had settled crooked after a storm. By the time their son was born, the tractor was already part of the family. By the time their daughter arrived 3 years later, photographs showed children sitting on its fenders before they were old enough to reach the pedals. The machine was present for nearly every important moment in their lives. Harvests, birthdays, family pictures, good years, bad years. When drought came, it kept running. When prices fell, it kept running. When storms flattened crops and left weeks of work buried under mud, it kept running. Frank trusted it because it never quit. And over time, the people around him began to say the same thing about Frank. Then, in February of 1961, everything changed. It happened on a Tuesday. The kind of ordinary day nobody remembers until it becomes the day that changed everything. Frank left the house before sunrise. He drank coffee. He checked the weather. He kissed Mary goodbye. Then he headed out to repair a fence line on the north side of the property. A neighbor found him later that afternoon. The truck was still parked nearby. The tools were still laying in the grass. Frank Collins never came home. He was 58 years old. The funeral filled the church. Farmers came from miles away. Some drove over an hour to attend. Many stood outside because there wasn't enough room inside. Everyone said the same thing. A man like Frank was hard to replace. The problem was that Mary wasn't trying to replace him. She was trying to survive without him. For a while she thought she could. She cut expenses. She sold cattle. She leased part of the acreage. She worked longer hours than she ever had before. But farms do not stop costing money simply because someone dies. Repairs still come. Taxes still come. Bills still come. And eventually, every envelope arriving in the mailbox seemed to carry bad news. The savings disappeared first. Then the livestock. Then the equipment. Each sale hurt a little more than the one before. But none of them felt final. Not until the tractor. The tractor was different. The tractor was Frank. Every scratch on the metal had a story attached to it. Every repair carried a memory. Every season of their marriage seemed somehow stored inside that old machine. That was why Mary waited so long to sell it. Long after it made financial sense. Long after the neighbors told her she should. Long after the bank quietly suggested it. Because once the tractor left the farm, there would be nothing left that still felt like him. And now, standing in her yard on that cold October morning, watching strangers gather around it with their hands in their pockets, Mary knew the moment had finally arrived. The last piece of Frank Collins was about to be sold. For $50. Auction day moved slowly. The way difficult days always seem to. The crowd grew larger as the morning wore on. Pickup trucks lined both sides of the dirt road. Men gathered in small groups near the barn and spoke in low voices. Some drank coffee from paper cups. Others simply stood with their hands in their coat pockets and watched. Nobody seemed eager to begin. Mary noticed that. People would look at the tractor for a moment, then look away. It was easier that way. The auctioneer, Carl Benson, had sold farms, equipment, and livestock for nearly 20 years. He had a voice that could carry across a pasture and a smile that usually came easy. Today he wasn't smiling much. By 10 o'clock, he climbed onto the flatbed truck and opened his folder. The sale began. A few tools sold first. Then some fencing equipment. A water tank. A trailer. Small things. Practical things. The crowd bid without much emotion. People raised hands. Numbers moved. Items changed owners. Life went on. Then Carl reached the tractor. The yard became noticeably quieter. Even the men standing farthest away seemed to drift closer. Carl read from his notes. The make, the model, the year, the repairs, the condition. His voice sounded strangely formal, as though he were describing something more important than an old machine. When he finished, nobody spoke. The tractor sat in the sunlight exactly where Frank had parked it months earlier. Waiting. Carl cleared his throat. All right, folks. He looked across the crowd. Let's start the bidding. Silence. A few men shifted their weight. One looked down at his boots. Another stared toward the barn. Nobody raised a hand. Everyone knew Mary was watching. Everyone knew what the tractor meant. But sympathy doesn't always turn into action, especially when money is involved. Carl waited, then tried again. Who'll give me $100? Nothing. The wind moved through the dry grass. A screen door somewhere behind the house creaked on its hinges. Still nothing. Mary stood perfectly still. She had prepared herself for this. Or at least she thought she had. But hearing the silence felt worse than hearing a low offer. Because silence meant nobody wanted it. Nobody wanted the machine Frank had loved. Nobody wanted the machine that had built their life. Finally, a hand lifted near the back. 50. The voice was flat. Businesslike. Just another bidder making another offer. Carl nodded. I have 50. The words seemed to hang in the air. $50. Less than a week's groceries. Less than a set of tires. Less than the coat Mary was wearing. 30 years of memories reduced to $50. Nobody raised the bid. Carl looked around. Surely somebody would offer 60. Or 75. Anything. Nobody did. The crowd remained silent. The man who offered 50 looked almost surprised that no one challenged him. Carl glanced toward Mary. Then quickly looked away. He didn't want to see the expression on her face. $50 once. The words landed hard. $50 twice. A few people shifted uncomfortably. One woman near the house shook her head. The bidder folded his arms. The sale was over. Everyone knew it. Carl raised his hand for the final call. $50. Before he could finish, a voice interrupted him. Ma'am, can I ask you something? The words came from the edge of the crowd. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just calm. Every head turned. A man stood beside a dusty pickup parked near the road. He wore a tan Stetson pulled low against the sun. A ranch jacket. Worn boots. Nothing remarkable. At least not at first glance. Nobody had paid much attention to him when he arrived. He hadn't spoken to anyone. Hadn't joined any conversations. Hadn't even moved closer to the auction. Now the entire yard was looking at him. The stranger took a few steps forward and looked directly at Mary. Did your husband buy that tractor new? For a moment, nobody understood why he was asking. Not the auctioneer. Not the bidder. Not the crowd. Even Mary looked confused. The question had nothing to do with the sale. Nothing to do with the value. Nothing to do with the auction at all. And yet something in the man's voice made everyone wait for her answer. The auction had stopped. The bidding had stopped. And suddenly, the most important thing in the yard wasn't the tractor. It was the question. Mary looked at the stranger for a moment. Then she nodded. Yes. Her voice was quiet. He bought it in 1933. The man glanced toward the tractor. The faded paint. The worn tires. The scratches left behind by decades of work. Then he looked back at her. Did he work it himself all those years? A few people exchanged puzzled looks. The bidder who had offered $50 frowned. The auctioneer remained standing on the flatbed, papers still in his hand. Nobody understood where this was going. Mary answered anyway. Every year. The stranger nodded. Even during the drought? A small smile touched Mary's face for the first time that morning. Especially during the drought. A few neighbors chuckled softly. They remembered those years. Everyone did. The stranger took another step closer. And he kept it running all that time? He could fix anything. This time there was pride in her voice. The kind that survives grief. The kind that survives time. If something broke, he repaired it himself. The man looked back at the tractor again. Longer this time. As though he wasn't seeing a machine. As though he was seeing the years behind it. The early mornings. The long harvests. The dust storms. The sacrifices. The life. Then he asked one final question. The question that changed everything. Did he serve? The yard became completely still. Mary blinked. For a second she seemed surprised. Then she nodded. Army. The stranger waited. She continued. Europe. The pause. He came home in 1945. Nobody spoke. Even the wind seemed quieter now. The stranger lowered his head slightly, as though acknowledging someone who was no longer there. Then he turned toward the auctioneer. How much is the bid? Carl cleared his throat. $50. The stranger looked at the man who had made the offer. Then back at the tractor. Then back at Mary. $50. The number seemed to sit there for a moment. Embarrassingly small. Finally the stranger spoke. No. His voice was calm, but firm. No man spends 30 years feeding his family from one machine for it to leave his yard for $50. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. The bidder folded his arms tighter. The auctioneer stared. The stranger reached into his coat pocket. Slowly, deliberately. Then he looked up. "I'll give 500. The reaction was immediate. Heads turned. Eyes widened. A few people actually laughed in disbelief. $500? For that tractor? The bidder who had offered 50 looked stunned. He had expected to win the machine before lunch. Now he wasn't even close. The stranger wasn't finished. He took another step toward the flatbed. "I'll give 500 because I'm not buying a tractor." His eyes moved toward Mary. "I'm buying 30 years of a man's life." Silence. Absolute silence. Several people lowered their eyes. Others looked toward the widow. Mary's lips parted slightly. She seemed unable to speak. The stranger continued. "Men like your husband built places like this." He gestured toward the farm. "The least we can do is remember what that's worth." Nobody in the crowd knew his name. Not yet. But something had changed. The sale was no longer an auction. It had become something else. Something bigger. And before the morning was over, every person standing in that yard would remember exactly where they were when it happened. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. The crowd simply stared. $500. It was 10 times the highest bid. For an old tractor. A tractor that most of them had assumed would be hauled away before noon. The man who had offered $50 shifted uncomfortably. Then he cleared his throat. $550. The words sounded forced. As though he wasn't entirely sure why he was saying them. The stranger nodded. 1,000. A murmur rolled through the crowd. Several heads turned. $1,000? For a machine nearly 30 years old? The bidder's face tightened. He looked at the tractor. Then at the stranger. Then back at the tractor again. This wasn't making sense. Carl Benson looked as though he had forgotten how auctions worked. "I have $1,000, he called. His voice cracked slightly. The stranger stood quietly with his hands at his sides. Completely relaxed. Like a man discussing the weather. The bidder hesitated. 1,100. 1,200. The answer came immediately. No hesitation. No calculation. No concern. Just certainty. The crowd began watching the stranger instead of the tractor. Who was this man? Where had he come from? Why did he care so much? An old rancher near the front removed his glasses and squinted. Something about the stranger seemed familiar. The way he stood. The way he spoke. The confidence. But he couldn't place it. Not yet. The bidding continued. 13. 15. 16. 2,000. That number landed like a hammer. The bidder stopped talking. The crowd stopped breathing. $2,000. The tractor wasn't worth $2,000. Everyone knew it, including the stranger. Especially the stranger. Because this had stopped being about value a long time ago. The bidder looked around. Looking for support. Looking for someone else to jump in. Nobody did. Every person standing there understood something now. The stranger wasn't buying equipment. He was defending a man's legacy. And nobody wanted to stand in the way of that. The bidder finally shook his head. "I'm out." His voice was barely above a whisper. Carl Benson blinked. Then looked down at his notes as if hoping they would explain what was happening. They didn't. Nothing in 20 years of auctioneering had prepared him for this. "I have $2,000. The crowd remained silent. "I have 2,000 once." Nobody moved. 2,000 twice. Mary stood frozen beside the tractor. Her eyes never left the stranger. She still didn't understand. Not completely. She couldn't. None of them could. "Sold." Carl lowered his hand. "Sold for $2,000. The crowd erupted into conversation. Questions. Whispers. Confusion. The stranger ignored all of it. He simply walked toward the tractor. Slowly. Almost thoughtfully. When he reached it, he placed one hand on the worn metal hood. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he turned toward Mary. And what he said next would leave the entire crowd speechless. Including her. Because the stranger had no intention of taking the tractor home. The crowd expected the stranger to ask where he wanted the tractor delivered. That would have been normal. That would have made sense. Instead, he rested his hand on the hood for a moment and looked at Mary Collins. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "when was the last time this tractor ran?" Mary swallowed. 3 weeks ago." The stranger nodded. "It still runs, then?" "Yes." Another pause. Then he smiled. Not a large smile. Just enough to soften the lines around his eyes. "Good." Mary looked confused. "So it'll still be useful?" A few people exchanged glances. Nobody understood what he meant. The stranger reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. He handed it to Carl Benson. "Count it." Carl opened the envelope. His eyes widened. Inside was the money. Every dollar of it. 20 crisp $100 bills. The auctioneer counted twice. The total didn't change. $2,000. Paid in full. No questions. No paperwork delays. No promises. Just cash. The crowd grew quiet again. The stranger then turned back toward Mary. "Mrs. Collins, your husband spent nearly 30 years sitting on that seat." Mary nodded. "He did." "He raised a family with it." Another nod. "Yes." "He kept food on the table with it." Mary's eyes began to shine. "Yes." The stranger looked down at the worn machine. Then back at her. "Then I think it belongs exactly where it is." For a second, nobody reacted. The words didn't register. Not immediately. Mary stared at him. "I'm sorry." The stranger took a step closer. "The tractor stays here." The entire yard went silent. Completely silent. Even Carl Benson stopped moving. Mary blinked. "I don't understand." "I bought it." "Yes. And now I'm giving it back." Nobody spoke. The words seemed too large to process. Mary looked from the stranger to the tractor and back again. Her lips trembled. "No." The answer came automatically. Almost instinctively. "No, I can't let you do that." The stranger tilted his head slightly. "Why not?" "Because I can't pay you." The words came out quickly now. "I don't have $2,000. I don't have $200. A tear escaped before she could stop it. "You shouldn't spend that kind of money on strangers." The stranger listened patiently. Then he shook his head. "You're mistaken." Mary frowned. "I am." "Yes." He glanced around the yard. At the farm. At the barn. At the fields stretching beyond the property. Then he looked back at her. "Your husband wasn't a stranger." The words landed harder than anyone expected. Several men lowered their eyes. Others stared at the ground. The stranger continued. "A man spends his life working land like this." His voice remained calm. "Raising a family, serving his country, helping neighbors whenever they're in trouble." He gently patted the hood of the tractor. "That man isn't a stranger." Mary could no longer hold back the tears. Neither could several people standing nearby. The stranger smiled again. "Consider it a thank you." No speeches. No grand performance. Just 4 simple words. "Consider it a thank you." The yard remained silent for several seconds. Then an older rancher near the front suddenly took off his glasses. He leaned forward, staring hard at the stranger. The face. The voice. The walk. The smile. Suddenly it clicked. His eyes widened. And before he could stop himself, the words slipped out. "My God." The crowd turned toward him. The old rancher pointed. Not at the tractor. Not at Mary. At the stranger. And for the first time all morning, people began realizing exactly who had been standing among them. The old rancher kept staring. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then he took a step forward. "No way." His voice had gone soft. Almost disbelieving. The stranger glanced toward him. The rancher laughed once under his breath. The kind of laugh that comes when a man realizes he's been looking at the answer the whole time. "No way," he said again. Then he removed his hat. Completely. Respectfully. And that was when the crowd knew something unusual was happening. The rancher pointed toward the stranger. "That's John Wayne." The words moved through the yard like a gust of wind. People turned. Heads snapped around. Several looked back and forth between the stranger and the rancher. John Wayne? The actor? The movie star? The man from the westerns? The stranger sighed softly. Not annoyed. Just resigned. Like a man whose name had finally caught up with him. A young farmhand near the barn squinted. Then his eyes widened. He's right. Another man nodded. I'll be damned. Suddenly everyone saw it. The face. The voice. The posture. The unmistakable presence. Not a stranger. Not a traveler. Not a passing rancher. It was John Wayne. Standing in the middle of a dusty farm auction. The crowd erupted into whispers. Mary Collins looked completely stunned. She glanced from the rancher back to the man standing beside her tractor. You. She couldn't finish the sentence. John Wayne smiled. A little embarrassed now. Afraid so. A few people laughed. The tension finally broke. But Mary wasn't laughing. She was still trying to understand why. Why him? Why her? Why this farm? Why her husband? As if sensing the question, Wayne looked out toward the fields beyond the house. For a moment he didn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than before. My father farmed. The crowd fell silent again. Wayne kept his eyes on the fields. Not here. The pause. But land looks the same wherever a man earns his living from it. Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved. My father taught me something when I was young. Wayne glanced down at the tractor. He said there are men who leave their names on buildings. Then he touched the faded metal with one hand. And there are men who leave their names on families. The words settled over the crowd. Heavy. Simple. True. Wayne looked at Mary. Sounds like your husband was one of those men. Mary lowered her head. A tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Wayne continued. When I heard you talking about him, he nodded toward the tractor. I realized nobody was really bidding on a machine. The crowd listened carefully. They were bidding on the last piece of a man's story. Silence. The kind that only comes when everyone knows they've just heard something they'll remember for years. Wayne reached into his pocket once more. This time he pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Mary. She looked down at it. Confused. What is this? A receipt. She frowned. A receipt? Wayne nodded. It says the tractor was sold today. Mary looked even more confused. But you gave it back. Wayne smiled. Exactly. She stared at him. Wayne's eyes twinkled slightly. Now if anybody ever asks who owns it, he pointed toward the machine. You can tell them it was bought and paid for fair and square. For the first time all morning, Mary laughed. A real laugh. The first one she'd managed since Frank died. And somehow that seemed to matter almost as much as the tractor itself. John Wayne watched her laugh. Then he nodded once. As though a job had finally been completed. The crowd assumed the story was over. They assumed Wayne would shake a few hands, climb into his truck, and drive away. But before he left, he did one more thing. Something that would affect the Collins family for years to come. Most people would have left after that. The tractor had been saved. The widow had been helped. The story already felt complete. But John Wayne wasn't walking toward his truck. Instead, he was looking across the farm. The barn. The windmill. The fencing. The fields beyond them. He saw the same thing every farmer in the county had seen. A farm that was struggling to survive. The tractor wasn't the only problem. It was simply the last one anyone had noticed. Wayne turned toward Mary. Who's helping you run this place? Mary hesitated. The answer embarrassed her. Nobody. Wayne frowned. No hired hands? She shook her head. No. What about family? My son works in Dallas. And your daughter? Married. Lives in Oklahoma. Wayne nodded slowly. The answer told him everything. The farm wasn't failing because Mary lacked determination. It was failing because one person can only carry so much alone. He looked around the crowd. Dozens of men stood there. Neighbors. Farmers. Ranchers. People who had known Frank Collins for years. Some had known him for decades. Wayne suddenly raised his voice. Not dramatically. Just enough for everyone to hear. How many of you knew Frank? Nearly every hand in the yard went up. Wayne wasn't surprised. How many of you ever asked him for help? A few chuckles rolled through the crowd. Then more hands appeared. Quite a few more. One man laughed outright. Everybody asked Frank for help. Several heads nodded. That was true. Frank had been the kind of man people called when things went wrong. A stuck truck. A broken fence. A sick calf. A late harvest. If Frank could help, he did. Wayne looked across the raised hands. Then he asked a second question. A simpler one. Did he ever send you a bill? The laughter disappeared. Nobody answered. Because everyone knew the answer. Frank Collins had never sent anybody a bill. Wayne nodded. That's what I figured. The yard grew quiet. Men began looking at their boots again. Not out of shame. Out of recognition. Because they knew exactly where this conversation was going. Wayne pointed toward the barn. Then toward the fields. Then toward Mary. Looks to me like Frank paid a lot of people over the years. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Wayne smiled slightly. Seems to me somebody ought to return the favor. For several seconds nothing happened. Then a voice came from near the front. I can help get the north fence fixed. Another voice followed. I've got a combine. A third man raised his hand. I can spare 2 days next week. Someone else offered fuel. Another offered labor. Another offered seed. Then another. And another. The offers started coming faster than anyone could keep track of them. Within minutes, the entire yard had transformed. The auction was gone. The sale was forgotten. Now it sounded more like a community planning a harvest. Mary stood frozen. Tears running freely down her face. Not because of the tractor. Not anymore. Because for the first time since Frank died, she realized she wasn't carrying everything alone. John Wayne watched it happen quietly. The same way he had watched the auction. Without taking credit. Without making a speech. Without asking for thanks. When the offers finally slowed, he glanced toward Mary. Looks like you've got some help after all. She tried to answer. The words wouldn't come. So she simply nodded. Wayne tipped his hat. The familiar gesture looked exactly the way it did in the movies. Except this wasn't a movie. There were no cameras. No script. No audience beyond the people standing in that yard. Just a widow. A tractor. And a community remembering who they were. Then John Wayne turned and started walking toward his truck. The hard part was done. The Collins family would never forget that day. And neither would anyone else who stood in that yard and watched what happened next.